today to my friend and former colleague at State, Carl Schonander, who is now Senior Vice President for Global Public Policy at the Software Information Industry Association, where he advises member companies and directs public policy initiatives in international policy, tech policy, information privacy, trade, internet governance, IP, educational technology. Probably the list would have been shorter if I just talked about things he doesn't interest. He has 25 years in the State Department, and his last assignment there, if memory serves, was a senior advisor for Europe, the OECD, and WIPO intellectual property affairs, where he, among other things, played a key role in obtaining approvals for the 2013 Marrakesh Treaty. He previously served as a special assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, where he managed the leadership of the Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science, which is very challenging. And he also spent 4 years as a trade policy advisor in the U.S. Embassy in Madrid, as over a decade as a senior advisor in various embassies and consulates around the world, so he had a very distinguished career. He also has a Master's of Law degree from GW down the street, a Master's from the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs, and a JD from the University of Stockholm. He speaks Swedish, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. He's also occasionally been known to speak English, which he will use today for his presentation. And I'm very glad to welcome you, Carl.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you
very much. All right. So first of all, I'm just going to make sure I know how this thing works. I just want to make sure I know how to flip the slides. Oh, there we go. Okay, great. So thank you for that really nice presentation. So my name's Carl Schonander. I work for the Software and Information Industry Association, which is one of the technology trade associations here in Washington, D.C. We have about 800 members. Some of the larger members that we recognize are companies like Red Hat and Adobe, also Google and Facebook, and we also have a number of publishers like Thomson Reuters and Pearson, and we have companies in the sort of data space like Refinitiv and IHS Markit and Dun & Bradstreet. And I think that the sort of common denominator for all of those firms, because they're all in wildly different businesses, different business models, et cetera, is they all use data in some form or fashion. Now, it's almost a sort of a truism to say that any company uses data, but it's all about data analytics, it's about data flows, it's about the ability to use that data, and if anybody can pick up the paper, if you, the discussion today here in the United States, technology policy, should there be a federal privacy law, should there not be a federal privacy law, what are the states doing? We're very active in California. California recently passed a privacy law, and states around the United States are doing that. And that's all, of course, in the sort of general context of what's happening in other countries as well. Europe passed something called the General Data Protection Regulation a couple of years ago, and other countries are following suit. So, United States and China, probably one of the most important trade relationships in the world, and one of the most important relationships, period. Title of the presentation is, we all know, ever since the administration came into power, that China would be a priority. So has there been what I call a paradigm shift in the relationship? Has the relationship in some sense changed fundamentally? Or are we really seeing a little bit of more of the same? Or as the French might say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. That's the only non-English phrase I'm going to use in this presentation. So, but by the way, the slide presentation that I'm delivering here is available on our website. I've sent it to the school here. You all are free to use it as you see fit. I would like attribution if you do use it, but I'm happy for you to use it. And I think its principal value really is to try to put things in a framework. It's not completely exhaustive, but it gives you the big picture of what's happened in terms of U.S. China economic relations since 2017. And it also gives you the links to some of the key documents that have come out. So, if you read any document about what the administration is doing with China or why it's doing it, probably the key document is what's known sort of colloquially as the 301 report, which came out on March 22, 2018. Now, I wouldn't advise you to read every single word in all 215 pages of the document. But I do, for those of you who are interested in this topic, it's worthwhile just taking a look at the table of contents. Because if you do that, which is about 2 pages long, you find out what is it the administration cares about with respect to U.S.-China economic relations. And I'm part of a trade association that we're a quote stakeholder in the discussion in Washington about what economic policy towards China should be, and we care about the issues that are listed in that document. So what are they? What are the complaints about? And you see here, I basically just shortened what's been put in the document. We're talking about technology transfer. Been a lot of discussion about China obliging companies to share, U.S. companies or foreign companies in general, to share their technology as a condition of doing business. Licensing processes, discriminatory licensing restrictions, outbound investment practices. That's kind of an interesting subject, because you unfair to achieve that goal, meaning, do they let state-owned enterprises buy companies overseas? Are those state-owned enterprises subsidized in some unfair way that lets them do that? So that's a big area. Cyber-enabled theft, and IPR stands for intellectual property rights. It's well documented Chinese espionage and activity in this area. Measures purportedly related to national security or cybersecurity. So remember I told you about data flows. One of the things that's happening in China, but not just in China, in other countries as well. I was talking to Professor Sinkin earlier, and he was mentioning Indonesia. We have this problem in Indonesia as well. But under the guise of cybersecurity, China has a cybersecurity law which mandates that companies store data in China, which mandates that testing of products might have to occur in China under the supervision of a Chinese regulator. Well, you can see how companies might take issue with something like that. Inadequate intellectual property protection. China's anti-monopoly law, that has to do with using competition law to, in effect, make it more difficult for foreign companies to operate in the country. Standards laws, developing standards which, in effect, make it more difficult for foreign companies to operate in China. The talent acquisition bit, that's about how Chinese firms are industries that they consider to be strategic, say artificial intelligence and others. But the thing about this is that it's not black and white. It's a little bit gray. So this is interesting. The Section 301 report sets out 3 categories of complaints. This is where we get to whether we're getting to a paradigm shift or not. trade agreement violations. You know, China does something which is contrary to their commitments to the World Trade Organization, then we can file what's called a case and say, hey, China, you're not keeping your commitments, change your policies. The U.S. government has done that in the past, and we've won a number of cases. But people think, and I think it's fair, that fair to say that has not been, in the last several decades, a very effective way of dealing with this. Acts, policies, or practices that are unjustifiable, defined as those that are inconsistent with U.S. international legal rights. And then the third, which is the most interesting, acts, policies, or practices that are unreasonable or discriminatory and that burden or restrict U.S. commerce. The U.S. government is focused on the third category of complaints. And the Trump administration is very upfront about that. I mean, and in this sense, I would say you do see a shift in policy and in emphasis with this administration compared to previous administrations. Previous administrations, when they look at these three sort of categories of complaints, they might have placed equal emphasis on each category. But the Trump administration says bluntly, no, we're focused on the third. And why is the third important? The reason the third is important is that there are laws which allow an administration to act unilaterally if they find acts or practices that are unreasonable or discriminatory and that burden or restrict U.S. commerce. So that's what the emphasis and focus has been on in the last couple of years. And they're focused on forced technology transfer, intellectual property rights transfers, policies and practices that undermine market-based licensing, Chinese policy that facilitates, quote, systematic investment in U.S. firms, and in a way that, you know, the administration might consider to be sort of nefarious from a national security or economic competitiveness standpoint, in a way that we would argue reflects non-commercial considerations upon the part of the Chinese acquirer, and then cyber theft and computer intrusions. There's an update report on this that came out late last year. It's a little bit shorter. It basically reiterates the same complaints and provides a little bit more information on this. So what is different? So I would say that under the Trump administration, there's been a shift to a more strategic outlook with respect to competition with China. A more aggressive use of tools to try to change Chinese behavior. I would argue that there's actually a kind of a bipartisan support for a more strategic approach to China. I would say the consensus on it breaks down with respect to the use of tariffs. And also, this is important, perhaps it's President Trump himself, but the Trump administration is focused on really two things on the economic side with China. One is the size of the trade deficit, the literal size of the trade deficit. President Trump has a record of over many years making that for him, the principal criterion in determining whether an economic relationship with a given country is fair or not. Now, there's no consensus on that. That's a view that he holds. There is a consensus that China is a systematic, strategic, geoeconomic, strategic competitor with the United States, and that whatever previous administrations have done since China joined the World Trade Organization in 1995, that whatever, or is it 2000? I did 2000. Whatever previous administrations have done, both Republican and Democratic, have not been sufficient. So, you know, if, as Professor Simkin noted, we were both members of the U.S. government, and over the years, the U.S. government established this very, very elaborate kind of architecture for discussing economic and political relations with China. But on the economic side, you had sort of two kind of gigantic annual discussions with China. One called the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, and the other called the JCCT, which standed for the Joint Committee on Commerce and something Trade. Can't remember exactly what the acronym stood for, but these were sort of gigantic annual processes in which departments from all around the U.S. government would engage in an interagency process for these annual meetings, sometimes several times a year, that happened with China on this or that issue. And there was ostensible progress. I mean, in the sense that every year China and the United States would get together, and China would undertake a commitment with respect to, say, intellectual property rights protection or licensing or whatever. And there was a general sense, and I think it's fair I think that sense was fair, that we didn't get a good return on investment from those processes. That Chinese behavior simply didn't change sufficiently to sort of continue doing business as usual in that way. That, as I said, both Democratic and Republican administrations did for really over 2 decades. So, as I said, there's been an aggressive use of trade policy tools and a shift away from emphasizing WTO enforcement. I spent a long time in my career doing trade policy, and whenever we thought that a country was doing something that we thought was unfair, discriminatory, et cetera, the first question we always asked ourselves was, can we file a case? Should we file a case under the World Trade Organization? And as I mentioned, there's been probably 25 cases filed against China, and the U.S. has probably won at least 20 of them. But again, the results of that just haven't been sufficient. So there's been an aggressive use of tariffs since President Trump took office. The Congress modernized something called the Foreign Investment Risk. They modernized an investment review process called SIIA through a piece of legislation called the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. I know it's a mouthful, but you can call it FIRMA for short. That was done, with strong administration support. My trade association and other trade associations played a role in shaping that piece of legislation as well. And then the administration has also worked on stricter export controls for technologies that they consider to be of critical strategic importance. So those are, I would say, the 3 major ways in which the U.S. government has attempted to sort of reset the economic relationship with China. So tariffs. There's 3 lists. There's 10% tariffs on about $200 billion worth of products. The thing is that late last year, the Trump administration had threatened to increase tariffs to 25%. They didn't do it. And why didn't they do it? They didn't do it because there are ongoing discussions between the U.S. government and China, led by Ambassador Lighthizer at the U.S., who's the U.S. trade representative, about getting to a deal. I think it's fair to say that President Trump really would like to, and Mr. Lighthizer really would like to get to some sort of deal with China. And there's a lot of, if you read the press, even the general press, but especially the business press, there's a lot of speculation as to what kind of deal Mr. Lighthizer, Ambassador Lighthizer, is going to bring back from his negotiations with the Chinese. Mr. Lighthizer, and I can say this both from the meetings that I've been in and also from the press, I think really is focused on the systemic problems in the U.S. China trade and investment relationship, and is trying to see changes in them. Other parts of the administration, especially in the Commerce Department, are maybe more focused on getting short-term increases in Chinese purchases of U.S. Products and services, and so there's a lot of speculation as to what this deal is going to look like. People will, including ourselves, will measure it by whether, to what extent it actually deals with some of these systemic problems that we have in the trade and investment relationship. So yeah, this is early this year. President Trump decided, or maybe it was late last year, I can't remember, decided to delay increasing the tariffs to 25% in hopes of getting a deal with China. And you know, this is a big deal, actually, no pun intended. Getting to a deal and the content of the deal, at least in the short term, affects markets. It affects a lot of things. So this is going to be one of the biggest sort of aspects of the Trump administration's policies in the first term. And it's interesting, it's been noted in the press that Ambassador Lighthizer is one of, the U.S. Trade Representative is a member of the cabinet. So he's in there in the government, and he's one of the longest lasting members of that cabinet. And enjoys quite a bit of, whether people agree or disagree with him, enjoys quite a bit of respect, I would say, within the U.S. government, but also in Congress, both Republicans and Democrats. So what do we think about all this? So we share the Trump administration's diagnosis of the trade and investment problem with China. But we do not concur with tariffs as the way to achieve change. We would prefer the Trump administration to work with other allies, such as the European Union, Japan, and others, to try to change Chinese behavior. Now, you could argue, well, that's just more of the same of what previous administrations did. But I do think that there's a difference. And I think the difference is that the sort of diagnosis that the Trump administration has of the trade and investment relationship with China is sort of shared in the European Union, Japan, Korea, other places. Doesn't mean they necessarily always want to follow our policies or anything like that. But I think the diagnosis is shared at least to some extent. So there is a sort of umbrella trade association called Americans for Free Trade, which we joined. We've also sent our own letters to the Congress about specific elements of the tariffs that we think harm U.S. industry and U.S. competitiveness. One focused on data centers, and another focused on Internet of Things. You can read all that in some of the links that I sent. FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. So that sort of provides something called the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, otherwise known as CFIUS, with expanded authorities. There's CFIUS can review more types of transactions, and what I'm talking about is foreign investment into the United States. So they can review more transactions. It gives CFIUS more time to make a decision. It makes it harder for companies to do what's called mitigation, which is find a way to convince the government that the foreign acquirer, in this case China, is not getting access to U.S. technologies or secrets. Gives CFIUS special hiring authority, etc. So that's that aspect. We were supportive. We were supportive of it, especially because there was some talk of expanding FIRMA authority to deal with American investments overseas as well as investments here. And since it only covered inbound investment, we eventually came around to supporting this piece of legislation. Export controls. Now this is really, really interesting. So, and a really, really tricky area. So for many, many years, and I know Professor Sinka knows this because the State Department's been involved in this together with the Commerce Department. There's a whole cottage industry of people who earn their living figuring out, what the U.S. government will allow you to export and not export, to what countries it can go to, and what countries it cannot go to. So late last year, the Department of Commerce put out a notice of proposed rulemaking pertaining to emerging technologies. Of course, we're all about emerging technologies. I work for a technology trade association. We're all about things like blockchain and artificial intelligence and cloud computing and Internet of Things and all of this stuff. So the administration is essentially proposing new rules which would govern the export of technologies and products and services in these areas. So you can see, specifically the ones that we're concerned about is artificial intelligence. What is not going to be affected by artificial intelligence? What product or service is not going to have some sort of AI component to it in the next 5 or 10 years? But things also like advanced computing technology, data analytics technology. For instance, there's some people who think that Chinese investments in companies that have access to American personally identifiable information should be prevented, because that would give China in some way a strategic advantage over the United States, and it's something to think about. Quantum computing. Anyway, you get the picture. So we did comment on this, and our position is that whatever rules in this area should be narrowly tailored. There should be exceptions for technologies not likely to raise national security concerns. We say seek evidence-based consensus with partners, including through an international, I don't know what you can call a Wassenaar arrangement, but it is an arrangement. That's what it is. That's why they call it an arrangement between 42 countries, which tries to come up with common criteria for what technology should be allowed to be exported. The problem with the Wassenaar arrangement is that it includes countries like Russia. So it's a little tricky to figure out how to work it. But anyway, we're in favor of trying to find an evidence-based consensus with partners. We think there should be exceptions for when U.S. firms export technologies overseas to affiliates that they control. It's a bit of a tricky area, but U.S. companies make commitments to the U.S. government all the time, so we think there should be an exception there. Firms offering emerging technologies through the cloud should not be considered to be exported. So you see where our letter was public. You can read it if you're interested. You see where we're going with that. In terms of academia, Georgetown University, they have a new think tank called the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, and they've done some interesting work in the export control area, which we think is quite good. They point out that AI software is unlikely to be an effective point of export control, neither are microprocessors for AI systems. But interestingly, their view is, we haven't taken a position on this one way or the other, but they're obviously trying to be, like we all are, as constructive as possible with our U.S. government interlocutors, because we all agree with the premise that China is in fact a geo-economic / strategic competitor, and therefore we do have to work with government. So anyway, they take the position that equipment for manufacturing artificial intelligence chips could be an effective point of export control. So, there's also sort of another area for what's going on now, and that's sort of what I broadly call foreign economic diplomacy. Speaking of emerging technologies, I'm sure you've all heard of 5G, which is the successor to 4G. That's many people. Everything is going to become faster, more data, more connection, quicker, et cetera, et cetera. Going to get the spectrum allocation done right to make that happen. There's competition between the U.S., Europe, and China on this. People say that, for instance, to make a reality, automated vehicles and automated drones and all that, 5G is going to be important for that. Anyway, the U.S. government, I'm sure you read this in the paper, has been trying to prevent other countries from using Huawei technology. And this gets sort of gray. The European Union came out with its own kind of strategy document for China. They didn't take a position specifically on Huawei. That particular document, individual member states have. Many member states are still buying Huawei technology, but looking at it from a security perspective. It's complicated because whatever your view is on Huawei, and they undoubtedly do cooperate with Chinese authorities, they do also produce technologies, very often cheap, that a lot of countries and companies want to buy. Some of it may be too cheap in the sense that it's not secure enough, not necessarily from a Chinese espionage perspective, but from a sort of general security perspective. But that's a different issue. And I think this foreign economic diplomacy with the U.S. government, trying to persuade other countries to treat China as a geostrategic economic competitor, not just any other sort of commercial partner, I think that'll continue. So, but what, okay, so we've had 2 years of this Sturm-und-Drang kind of, meetings between, I think the first meeting that President Trump did was actually with the President of China in Mar-a-Lago. And then after that, you may recall that after that meeting, the Chinese committed to buying more soybeans and other agricultural products. But anyway, it was the first meeting, and so there's been a lot of back and forth between China and the United States. But what's actually happened in terms of economics? Well, actually, in 2018, the goods trade deficit with China actually went up, didn't go down, despite the tariffs. And by the way, the Chinese have put tariffs on U.S. products coming into China as well. So there is a little bit of a trade war going on there, but it's so far kind of a controlled trade war. So goods trade deficit up, that hasn't changed. But where you do see a change, and I think that change is attributable in large measure because of the Trump administration's actions and positions, is there's a Baker McKinsey report out on Chinese investment, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well, and it's down. It's down by a lot. And I think that's driven by Chinese policy shifts, but it's also driven by extra scrutiny of Chinese investments in the United States and Europe. So that has changed. There you can see a real change in the last couple of years. But the question is this a paradigm shift? And I think the jury is still a little bit out there. Now, one of the big authorities on U.S. China relationships is a gentleman by the name of James Lewis, who works for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I thought it was worth including a quote from him on this, which is to say this: what is new is that unfair trade, security, and industrial policies, which are tolerable in a smaller developing economy, are now combined with China's immense government-directed investment and regulatory policies to put foreign firms at a disadvantage. China now has the wealth, commercial sophistication, and technical expertise to make its pursuit of technological leadership work. The fundamental issue for the United States and other Western nations and the IT sector is how to respond to a managed economy with a well-financed strategy to create domestic industry intended to displace foreign suppliers. And I think that that's the fundamental question here. I think that's the question that the administration is asking. That is what Mr. Lighthizer is trying to change in his negotiations with China. So, as I said, paradigm shift discussion continued. We still don't know what kind of deal Ambassador Lighthizer will strike with China. But I do think, going forward, at a minimum, the United States and other Western industrial powers will continue to scrutinize Chinese investment carefully. I think that I sort of analogize this to Brexit. I mean, you haven't seen, in terms of the trade flows, as I mentioned, the trade deficit is up with China. You haven't seen massive changes, but I do think, I hear this anecdotally from members and other companies, I do think that companies going forward are going to hedge their bets in terms of supply chains with China. I mean, the United States kind of built an economy with China, especially in the tech sector, which was all about R&D here, building stuff in China, assembling partly there and partly here. I mean, the smartphone, of course, is everybody's favorite example of that. I don't think that's going to go away entirely, but I do think U.S. companies are going forward, going to hedge their bets and look for other countries for which they can source products and services as well. I think some of that might have happened anyway because China's economy is changing, wages are going up there, it's no longer the low-cost paradise that it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. China is in fact changing its macroeconomic policy to be a more consumption-based economy rather than an export-led economy, in part because of jawboning from the United States and other countries, but also because they need to do it. So I think that's going to be happening. What is clear, I think, to me, and I think this will happen, this trend will persist even if Trump is not reelected next year. I think a Democratic president or a Republican president would view this the same way. I think the United States, and maybe also the EU, and perhaps Japan and Korea, I haven't followed them as closely, so maybe Professor Simkins can speak to that. I do think that national security considerations are going to play a bigger role in determining economic policy with China. I think at a minimum, investment screening and export controls will become more important in both the United States and the European Union. That was the end. Oh, and I thought I had linked to an EU document. But anyway, there it is, the EU Strategic Outlook Communication. That's worth, for those of you who are interested in European policy in this area, that's worth taking a look at as well. It lists sort of 10 actions that the EU wants to take in terms of its not just economic but also political relationship with China. There's at least 3 of those 10 action items are relevant to the technology sector. That's just a communication, that's just a strategy document. It doesn't bind or oblige the member states to do anything, and there's a big debate going on in Europe on this. The Europeans are divided, like they are on many things. For just to give you one example, Italy wants to participate in something in the Chinese Silk and Road Initiative. Other EU member states do not, so we'll see where they go with this. But I think, broadly speaking, there's an increasing sort of recognition of China as not just any other country, and not just any other country that we can comfortably deal with using WTO mechanisms. There's an increasing view that we need to view China through a geoeconomic, geostrategic lens as well. And so that's sort of where I land on this paradigm shift question. So that's the end, and I think I've spoken too long. We have 15 minutes for Q&A.
Yes, I have a microphone here. Frank Fletcher, Director of Lectures and Seminars. So let's please raise your hands and call on people.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I have several concerns, and for several reasons. First, we always, United States always blame on China without really considering how to fix the United States first. I don't think United States have a credibility, not just for foreign trade, but just domestically. It's just general practice. Domestically and for foreign trade, of course, you do it together. Because if there's no credibility, United States always in a losing end, not just compared to China, but compared to how America productivity first, and then how to calculate the production or investment. But then the whole thing is really upside down in the United States in this very serious vicious cycle. So first is the United States also always blame on other people, let's say cyber security. But in fact, the security problem is most problem is within the United States. What I mean is the problem is within the United States rather than complain on other people's cyber security. The United States, within the United States, people or farm, individual business is hacked by United States. So I just thought the control, just by control, is the same thing. That China to other country, they don't say I want to control. Instead, they use the diplomatic way.
We appreciate your comments. I'm very glad to hear you
So,
come to a conclusion and ask the questions.
yeah, so could
We have a
you,
lot of questions.
yeah,
Thank you.
I just to say that the whole thing like this, could you really emphasize the problem, how to fix the United States, whether it is general unjust practices or a diplomatic method, and with a good attitude rather than say we are a king.
So thanks for that. Here's what I would say about that. I would say that there are many things which China gets right, and which I would say the United States could do more of. For example, China as a country is investing as a percentage of its GDP a great deal more than the United States in basic R&D, basic research and development, which is a key driver in technological progress. We in the United States ought to do more in that area. So it's not entirely black and white. There's a little bit of gray there. But there are also sometimes not even subtle, clearly unfair in trade and investment practices. For example, U.S. companies, U.S. cloud computing companies cannot provide services in China. I mean, that's just not right. And so that's one of the things, for example, there's a lot of speculation in the press that Ambassador Lighthizer, one of the wins that he may bring back with him, is an ability for for U.S. cloud computing companies to provide services in China. And there are other examples like that as well.
Question.
My name is Arnold Zeitman. I've been teaching in China for the past 15 continued. Could you be a little more specific as to what the United States wants from China, and in fact what China wants from the United States, and perhaps discuss the prospects for either one getting what it wants?
Sure. Well, access to the cloud computing market is one thing. The ability to invest and sell products and services without having to get into a joint venture agreement with a Chinese company, where the Chinese company then, by hook or by crook, gains access to U.S. Intellectual property rights. I would say better enforcement of intellectual property rights standards. I would say, for instance, there are licensing rules in China which, that's actually an IP violation as well, which limit the ability of U.S. companies to license products and services on commercial terms. There's a whole host of things that we would like to see China do. In terms of what they would want from us, I guess you'd have to ask them, but I think they're interested in the status quo. Because from their standpoint, they did, and the thing is, a lot of countries in Asia, people used to talk about the tigers, built export-led, export-driven economies. And we have bigger countries that do that too. I think Germany, for instance. Japan, back in the 1980s, when Ambassador Lighthizer started his career under the Reagan administration. The problem with China is that it's so big, it's too destabilizing for China to continue to derive so much growth from its export-led driven growth model. But I think they realize that, and they're moving to a more consumption-based model. So.
Does the fact that they're interested in the status quo mean there's really no incentive for them to change?
Well, I think the incentive for them is, if they want to continue to do business with the United States, they're going to have to make some concessions. The question is, the question is, are they willing to make the systemic concessions? We know they're willing to buy more soybeans. We know they're
not going to change things.
But that's not going to change things. That's right. So we'll see.
We have a question here, and then we'll go over here.
Good morning. My name is Robert Shines, Bright Group Consulting. Thanks again for your presentation. My question is the reciprocal enforcement mechanisms that have been proposed as a result of the latest talks. Do you think that's actually going to work?
I don't know. I don't know. That's the honest answer. I don't know.
Another question here?
Good afternoon, thank you for coming. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. In regards to the immense amount of languages that you speak, which is incredible, we all know that language helps you understand the culture of a people, and understand the culture of a people helps you better deal with them in terms of how you want to formulate the policy of your country in relation to how you deal with other countries. So my question is, have you figured out a way to learn languages easier than the rest of us know about? And is that how you learn so many? And if you have, can you inform us of how you've been able to acquire that kind of knowledge? Thank you.
That's a good question, but the answer is no, I haven't.
We are a graduate school, so this is relevant to that.
My name is, you can hear my voice, my name is Kenneth Otto. I'm an intelligence course program student here at J.M. Morgan. And a lot of the language you use in this presentation is that there's like unfair trade practices. There's a deficit and imbalance between how much China exports versus how much we import. China doesn't buy that much from us, but our U.S. companies engage and want to do more business with China. But if they don't want U.S. businesses to trade more with, if they don't want U.S. companies to trade more in China, and we are also seeing a lack of foreign direct investment into the U.S., how is that unfair? It seems like they don't necessarily need us as much as we would like them to need us, but we want them to spend more money on our shores to offset the deficit. I think that's like a poor way to go about it, because you're like saying, well, it's unfair. It sounds like a baby. Like, it's unfair, so do more with us. And it just sounds childish. Like, it just sounds. So what do you have to say to that?
Well, there's a lot there. What I would say is, I certainly don't share the view that a deficit or surplus per se is the indicator for whether a trade relationship is fair or not. So most mainstream economists believe that trade deficits or surpluses reflect macroeconomic indicators much more than they reflect sort of trade law indicators. But there's disagreements about that. I mean, my view is not shared by President Trump. President Trump, for the last 30 years, has said that he believes trade deficits are a sign of unfair trade, U.S. economic weakness, etc. So there's different views. I'm just giving you my view.
Okay.
In terms of sort of fairness or unfairness, there's also you have to look at it sort of pragmatically as well. I agree. The trade deficit is more a reflection of macroeconomic circumstances, strength of the U.S. dollar, for example. But once trade surpluses reach a certain level, and I think Professor Sinkin remembers this well from the 1980s and Japan, they become politically very difficult to manage, no matter what your view on the economics of it are. And so they need to be managed in some way politically. Well, that's one point. And then the second point, on the sort of individual, which you were Professor, I'm not sure your name, but this gentleman up in the front was talking about, what are the specific practices that we are concerned about in China? They're real. They are real, and those concerns are shared across the political spectrum in the United States, not just President Trump. They're shared by Republicans and Democrats, and they're shared by people in other countries as well. And our view is we need to try to address them in some form or fashion. We don't agree with the tariffs, but the Trump administration makes the argument that the tariffs are what have brought China to the table. I mean, we'll see. We'll see what kind of deal Ambassador Lighthizer brings back. And we'll go from there.
We have time for one more question. This gentleman here, Dr. Fenderson.
Thank you very much. I usually do not have questions, but I usually make a comment.
Okay.
Actually, during my PhD course, University of California, Riverside, I did a critique of WIPO, Barnett's book, Global Reach, and Vernon, Sovereignty at Bay. And I critique that globalization is harmful to at least countries in Africa and other developing countries. And most of the arguments that Trump is making is what I put on that time for the United States. So if anybody have time, check those two books, and then I'll find from Dr. Dr. Ron Chico, if he still have my critique, I'll send it to Trump, and he'll be happy.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for all attending. Let's thank our speakers. And we have another event on the 25th on the U.S. Japan Korea trilateral security cooperation.
Here you go. Thank you. Sure. Forced me to put all this together. That's the EV teaching. Go over the stuff I'm doing myself. As soon as I write something, I forget it. Oh, sure. They're hedging their supply chains. But they might have done that anyway.
No, they would have been. Nothing to do. Right. No.
I work in California and here.
Today.
Now.
Sure.
Right now.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Oh, yeah, you know.
Monday, I said, but I'm happy to take any questions.
What they did.
Many times. Many
Look at it.
And not on Friday, I think I can.
That's a Friday. Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria,
There's some Walmart that you find everything about Japan and the all Japanese all
Right, but let me send you a time. Thank you. Okay.
That was outside of regular.
Oh, yeah, I should get into it.
That was Japan.
Well, that's
to refer to the United States. Well, you know, we used to say California, several other states on the version of Toyota and Japanese to be also outside of California. They used to see and put those tribes and states that were right before they shut up. And they have, I mean, it's 20 minutes, right? So it's a very complicated something that was good. So why is it that with the Russians we mocked it? Well, I mean, that's where in all states.
Because the Chinese armies today, have been able to combine
and therefore they made it work a while. So what you generally do is find they take their house and they fall into the business contract. And they there are ways because they're not people in those states like
well, there's still China's just
but that's not going to necessarily take place in China.
well, no, with Chinese, You have to find choice, and that's the connotation,
It has a
right?
different
What you
connotation.
tend to find is
Essential
just the opposite. Chinese
on
engage in racism.
in there 4 or 5 companies.
Those elements are very just the opposite. Because one of the things you look at right there, in China, a lot of
Then, what they doing is first of all, they may
it's
learn English for our students.
It's
They got
design, technology aspects of it,
and returning immediately to Africa and set up the entire continent as an Islamic
All right,
state.
John Rock and Roll, thanks. Great to see you. See you May 1.
Do you think
No,
you
you know they
could
they
use the same word?
Thank you. Like I said, I don't
Even
know.
in you went from Puerto Rico to Mexico.
So in other words, I'm saying, because Hillary Clinton and Obama and
Maybe we'll
Sarkozy
lecture on
and
this.
Qatar and NATO
maybe.
went after Gaddafi because of the Soviet project. The only reason
So I'll give you,
for that is
I'll
because
give you
this is
this
the best country in the world. Okay, you have no idea.
I came in on my vacation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Let me show what I tell African leaders when I meet them.
So,
We were the ones who actually did the killing in
You
Africa
can
to
look at
get
me
it.
and see,
Not
I'm
only
not
strike
in the
as a
Yeah,
very
you-
country.
you-
No, I tell them, I'm not ready to start killing the black communities instead. On what's the white communities? If I didn't kill the black communities, then I'm racist. I kill.
well, I mean, there are no things to talk about.
I'm just. No, we're not gonna use I'm just, that.
So we're talking about the thing overall,
Well, why don't you, I know you probably gonna close out.
you know, he's done, because I think they've actually taken away all the issues.
Yeah, the map.
That's why.
This is our.
Oh, okay.
The trade laws are not going to adjusting the trade laws.
Yes, you will talk you into,
I tell people I make sculpture now.
Yeah.
I tell them, what's up with the
Massive changes.
And thus, this is the best.
So the
back
economy,
when we
now they're starting to really privatize some more of it for it to expand because we have a surplus.
because generally you might see that
lot of money.
until later in the day.
Our economy's grown through
We have
privatization and free trade.
7.
And now, and you have,
I'm not
you
already
have some people
More
political
time
that
to
and small,
That's
small government.
But when I came to this country,
So you have to allow for companies to do
I
some
hear
trade
it.
as it please.
That's when you start this study.
You know, push that back to the government and say like, oh,
I was a member of the government, special operation in California, all over for 67 years. I have limited, right?
also politically,
Amazing.
them and the Republicans are on the same page.
So let's go to the world, even though it has some blemishes.
Small government. You can't tell the government to place laws and ask them to like.
Vice President.
get back in.
So I have your email address and everything.
I know the advancement office.
This type of conversation.
You just write it later, right?
Exactly.
So you go to what? You said you go to
It'll
what?
take a while.
What?
You said you go
What
to
kind
what?
of critique?
Small base, we have.
In your dissertation. In your dissertation.
Not for my.
But we're building one.
You're gonna keep it close, right?
No, but my
But
dissertation.
these kind of things you have here, it's very
is-
important for that,
is
because you
state,
can invite them back to things
Social
like that, they
classes
always
and
be
public policy.
Yes.
connected to the institution and also committed.
State social classes.
Public policy.
Okay.
So I understand
A lot of
what
graduate
type of
institutions
social
are
forces,
really poor,
social
even
economic
Howard.
forces
Yeah.
is
We
pushing
focus
Trump
mainly
and
on
something like that.
undergrad, and that's a, hey, in medical, medicine is all,
Universities do.
but not PhD.
So we have to
I still would be many attacked in
Tend
bureaucracy
to,
because
graduate alumni
in
tend
a
to
sense I'm still a Maoist. In fact, I recently said he gets,
But see,
where
working
are
here,
you
we
from?
do a lot of
Originally
things.
from West Africa, I traveled on Sierra Leone passport.
Alumni,
Sierra Leone passport.
Sierra Leone.
and they work close
You
to
know,
advancement.
constantly I'm reminding him
So we'll get there.
that he
Yeah,
has
it's
to want
gonna
to
take
go
time.
or to
You gotta graduate critical mass.
like Mao Zedong. Because the reason Mao Zedong launched the Counter-Revolution was the political class.
That's a good question. I think it's had various people over time.
We're refusing to execute.
Yeah, but
We work
he's
with an
not,
architect
he's not the
here,
person to do that.
in the
No,
DC
I'm-
area.
He's not the person
I'm
to do that.
advising him what he should do to get it.
He's not the person to do that. I
They
agree
have-
with you,
they
but he's
have-
not the person
I
to do
think, combined with the founding, they have a good sense of what they wanted the place to look like, what they wanted it to
When you hear
represent,
new
given,
campaign,
you know, what our,
we used to say,
what our academic core is, what our academic strength is, and I think they were able to carry that out through the architectural process.
Yeah. 4th of July.
How has your trip been so far?
That's
I'm sorry?
How
from
has
now
your
on,
trip
you're gonna
been so
look
far?
at the border.
Actually, I live in Washington.
You're not out
But
in
I'm in
California.
California every, about every fourth or fifth week.
I said, you know, to maybe announce it
And,
July 4th. So you, and then you say in 3 months.
It's okay
you withdraw. So
once
you
you're
give
there
time
on
for
either
the-
side
Right.
for a day, but the first day is tough because the time zone.
To
For example, my
mobilize
office,
10
my office in California,
million people
They
to
don't come
invade
to now.
America.
9 o'clock.
I say, you see how fast it
It's
is.
noon here.
Yeah.
I'm ready to go out for lunch.
That's what I do.
And they're ready to talk. And they're ready to talk. When I get back, I got a window from about 1 to 3
Yeah.
to talk to them because it's
I work for the
they
state
go.
government
Right.
of
And
California.
of course, they have 3
Oh,
o'clock meeting at
I
6
leave
o'clock at night for me. So I tend
2006
to
to come work on this project.
try to stay around 8 o'clock at night, but I tend to come in later.
So he wants to unify Africa.
Yes.
But it's,
Where you from?
it's
I'm
interesting.
from,
The
I'm
world
half Ghanaian, half
And my,
Guyanese.
one of my
That's
staff
very good.
colleagues is in Austria.
Chinese.
So
Oh,
I'm
like community.
I got 6 hours for her.
Chetty
Yeah,
Jenner.
I've done that too. I have carried those relationships on all the way out to the Middle East where,
I'm 76 years
Oh, yeah,
old.
my
they wanna do
my
a
family
call at
died
9
that
o'clock in the morning for
they,
them, which is usually midnight
if
for
you
me.
trace the back to values far, far
I-
enough, it
I'm
goes back
I'm
to
living
slavery.
with, I have done that.
Yeah.
Right now, my evaluator for a project I have in Vienna.
It's the CIA who brought me.
And she maintains a room here in
There was a lot going
Washington.
on.
And she can fly from
Yeah.
Russia as well
I
as,
was supposed to go to.
not much longer than me flying to California.
Well, yeah.
I mean, I've done that, if you get an early enough flight out,
The CIA
in the morning in Austria, she can be here by the time you get
Yes.
out. That's right.
Dr.
World
Jim
got tiny.
Hyde, he's now
It has.
in Vermont.
So, we can take a walk out this way. and we'll talk about
You know what? If I don't get, I would have been the original.
Yeah, go ahead, Stuart.
Thank you so much, thank you so much. I look forward to coming back.
Yes,
So,
thank
okay.
you. So I'll get with you about.
Yeah, we'll get Dr. Hill on the.
Yeah, I'm doing well, I can't complain.
You never do complain. Very good one. Thank you, Frank.
If I went to the Soviet bloc, I would have been the original Carlos the Jackal.
Oh, really? Oh, my heavens. Well, I will pray about that.
No, you're gonna find my book interesting when I write my, when this federation is set up, that's when I'll write my memoirs.
Is there a way I could, is there a way I could read your published work so
No,
far?
I don't have any published work.
Not even the dissertation?
Oh, you go look for it, I don't know. I could finish my, when people tell me PhD, I said, oh, that's very fast. I'm always into what I'm doing now.